Have you ever wondered if, as believers, we should feel proud of our country, serve in the army, or support a cause of our nation? Or perhaps have you ever considered having your country's flag in your house? If many characters in the Bible, such as David as king of Israel, Gideon as a commander, or Joseph and Daniel as governors, served their nation, or even in foreign countries, does that mean that we can too dedicate ourselves to politics? Shalom everyone and welcome back to another video here on Jóvenes Peregrinando or Youth Pilgrims. And in today's video, we're going to answer these and other questions related to nationalism, patriotism, and the stance that, according to the Torah, the scriptures, and the Messiah, we should adopt. So let's begin with the first point. First, what exactly is patriotism? The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the love of one's country and the desire to defend it, but it can also be understood as devotion and a sense of attachment to one's country and its values. It often involves a strong emotional connection to the homeland, expressed through civic duty, respect for national institutions, and a willingness to contribute to its own good. Now, what is nationalism? The Oxford English Dictionary defines nationalism as a political ideology and movement that seeks to advance the aims of a nation and a strong feeling of pride and love for one's country that may be considered better than any other. Now, to properly dive into this topic, we're going to need an example of a nation or society where nationalism can clearly be seen. And what better example than the United States of America? The United States will be our example not by coincidence, but because they've actually been one of the main countries where modern nationalism as we know it today first emerged, along with France, and from there it spread to many others. However, it's in the United States where this sense of nationalism and patriotism is seen the strongest and most deeply rooted, and it even carries a kind of prophetic meaning. Now, to really understand where American nationalism comes from, we need to go back in time to when great European powers like Spain, Portugal, and Great Britain set out to conquer the world. The English, in particular, colonized North America and founded the 13 colonies. And at the same time, the English were deeply influenced by the Enlightenment philosophy, which carried political values like democracy and promoted the idea of progress based on humanism. In other words, it focused on human knowledge, military power, expansionism, and colonialism, also probably under the excuse of spreading democracy. It's also important to remember that the English were Protestants. After Martin Luther's Reformation, England adopted its own version of Christianity, which is known as Anglicanism. They saw themselves as the people of God, as they call them, believing that the lands of America were a kind of promised land for them, and viewed the native peoples of America as animals or beasts, which in their minds justified exterminating them. It might sound harsh, but the truth is that this mindset still exists today in 2025, just in a more subtle and less openly violent way, but still deeply racist. And the pressure from English taxes, the huge distance from their homeland and the king, the autonomy they already had, and especially the rising influence of democratic values spreading through Europe, particularly from France, all pushed them to create a new identity built around the idea of freedom. They wanted to free themselves from the control of the English crown, which led to their Declaration of Independence in 1777. And it's right here where nationalism, as we know it today, really begins. Little by little, the United States started becoming a global power through different means. Much later, it took advantage of the World War II to get involved all over the world, and even though they couldn't even defeat Germany without the Russians, the US managed to redirect most of the credit and attention toward itself. This was mostly because of the growing tension with Russia over communism, which led to the Cold War, simply because communism went against their democratic ideals. So the US tried to take as much credit as possible for the victory, since they were also in the middle of the space race and couldn't afford to lose to the communists they hated so much. All of this just made it to grow even more inflating the sense of national pride that defines the United States and reinforces the idea of being the land of freedom or the liberator of nations. And of course, this fantasy is kept alive by the country's massive cultural influence, the one that looks and distracts people everywhere. We're talking about Hollywood and entertainment, but its self-written story of victory, about democracy, economic stability, abundance. In short, the famous American dream, basically. Its ego and ambition has grown to such a level that the US has become the country with the most military bases in the world, 128 bases in 51 different countries, just as a fact, acting like the world's police. It has taken advantage of wars all over the globe to gain political and economic benefits from the Vietnam War and the Korean War, the conflicts in Latin America, Afghanistan, Syria, between Ukraine and Russia, and even today in Israel and the Middle East. And basically, it has gotten involved in almost every global conflict, always somehow tied to war. I think most of us have seen those memes where the US is pretty much represented by guns or weapons. And honestly, that's just a reflection of reality. So, with these nationalist ideals, this identity and fantasy of freedom and democracy, and their huge military power, the United States started relying on force, on weapons, and on war to slowly begin dominating the world. And that's why, to really understand this kind of nationalism, we need to look at one of its most important tools for staying in power, which is the military. And now we're getting closer to one of the darkest and most serious sides of American nationalism, which are the values that are taught inside the military. So let's divide it as if they were levels of commitment to the country. In the first level, and firstly, how are nationalism and patriotism taught in school? It all starts with what looks like community service, especially in high school. They ask if you're willing to help others or to serve others, starting with your neighbors, and in general, if you're willing to do good for your own country. And naturally, most people will say yes, of course, they want to help others. But it doesn't stop there. On the second level, once the idea of service is planted, they start teaching the so called military values, which they sum up as integrity and honor. Integrity because they tell you that you need to understand what justice really means and have the integrity to do what's right, even when it's hard. You must be honest to serve your people. Then they start shaping you the view of what the United States represents. As we have already mentioned, they present it as a hero, the symbol of justice and freedom, as if the country itself was the definition of democracy and righteousness, as if it were some kind of supernation meant to bring freedom and democracy to everyone through war. And because of that, they encourage pride in being American, almost as if it were a superior or privileged race because of its knowledge and power. They implant the idea that by joining the military, you're becoming part of a greater cause to help others or free them from their communist or terrorist governments. But in reality, half of that cause hides second intentions. Now, getting to the third level, here you're giving your life to the military, to your nation. Inside the military, there are all kinds of professions, not just soldiers, pilots, or marines. There's medicine, healthcare, communications, cybersecurity, engineering, even music, etc. And of course, the Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, and so on. What that means is that when you join the military, whatever you do or whatever you study, whatever your passion is, becomes tied exclusively to the military. And this obviously doesn't stay at the professional level, it reaches into family life too. In regular nationalism, people decide how much they want to let it into their personal lives, but in the military, that choice just doesn't exist. If you get married, for example, and both you and your partner are in the military, you might end up assigned to completely different areas or even deployed to faraway places, thousands of miles away, or even in different countries. If one of you is in the military, it doesn't really matter that you have a family. At some point, you'll have to leave them behind because your duty to your nation comes first. That means that the military service becomes a priority even above your own family, whether you like it or not. In fact, divorces are common because couples are forced apart, and that often leads to infidelity and separation. And finally, within the military, you're obligated to follow your superior's orders exactly, even if you know more than they do, or if they are wrong, you have no choice, you have to obey, or you can end up in jail. And finally, the fourth level. This level is an extension of the previous one, but here nationalism doesn't just take over your personal and professional life, it reaches into your psychological and spiritual one. Because inside the military, the ultimate proof of loyalty and honor you must be willing to give is to kill and to die. Kill and die. You must be ready to kill for your nation, and at the same time, you must be willing to die for it. And why? Because the nation comes first before everything. It becomes your religion, your life, basically. In the end, you're conditioned to follow orders and perform extreme acts of loyalty. Sometimes you can even be treated almost like a dog, trained to obey. And interestingly, soldiers at the front lines wear something called a dog tag necklace. It carries their personal information, so if they die in battle, their bodies can be identified. But what does this level of control and submission reminds us of? A slave, basically. In other words, you became a literal slave to a nation that in no way serves the father, the creator. Some people even describe it as losing your personality. Just imagine the level of slavery that represents. Okay, now, why are we talking about all this? And here's where we need to stop and think. What do the scriptures say about it? What does Yeshua say about all this? And first of all, when it comes to the military in a context of war, a believer in the battlefield would be in a situation where they need to kill, but we have no right to take anyone's life, especially for the earthly cause of a pagan nation. And the only one who has the right to give and take life is the Creator, because He is the creator of those lives. We also shouldn't die for the cause of a pagan nation. Nowhere in the Bible we will find that we should take someone's life just because they are against our country. On the contrary, what Yeshua teaches is that we must first be humble, and in the Brit Hadashah, or the New Covenant, we're taught that a believer must correct others and confront the foolish not with war or with swords, like before, but through the word. In fact, the word itself is described in the scriptures as a double-edged sword, because it represents a weapon of judgment and correction when it's in the hands of the eternal, when it's in the hands of true justice. And that's exactly what the word does with the foolish. We even see a clear example of this when Yeshua allowed himself to be taken captive in the Mount of Olives. One of his disciples, Shimon Kefa, also known as Peter, pulled out his sword, cut off the ear of Malchus, one of the high priest's servants, but Yeshua immediately intervened, rebuked him, and even healed the man's ear. You can find this in the book of John, chapter 18, verses 10 to 40. This doesn't mean that we should tolerate everything or everyone, but that we must judge with righteous judgment, just as the Messiah did, without ceasing to be pacemakers. If we are to be loyal to something, it must be to our faith and to the eternal, using the word and the truth, just like Yeshua did when he confronted the temple ministers, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the people, and all those who opposed to the message of the good news in the Torah. But we are not to act against someone by doing something that isn't our place, not by killing, nor by taking vengeance. That only belongs to the eternal. On the other hand, let's remember that the religion giving this country its identity is Protestant Christianity, and the problem is that many people believe the United States is some kind of nation inspired by God, and that its leaders and politicians have divine backing and are doing God's will, as they call it, or that they are somehow the people of God. It's almost like going back to the Middle Ages when political leaders claimed divine authority, to the point that they say things like, God bless America, with an ego and pride that are incredibly inflated. They believe that serving their country is also serving God, that honoring their flag just because it represents a Christian nation somehow pleases him. But all of that is completely wrong. And why? Because the only God they truly serve is the God of this world, meaning Satan. And first of all, Christianity itself is already a problem because it's actually a pagan religion created by the Romans to keep control over the believers when they were losing power due to the growing strength of the good news or the gospel. It basically became mixed with all kind of Roman pagan traditions. And that's why in the book of Revelation, Catholicism, Christianity, and all the distorted religions based on the Bible are referred as the great harlot, because they are a corrupted and adulterated mix of sin and paganism. And secondly, because the Eternal would never ever be pleased with anything this nation is doing, not its religion, not its army, not its plans, not its politicians, not its beliefs, not anything. He would never favor a nation like this one, no matter how Christian it claims to be. Now, as we mentioned at the beginning, there were indeed biblical figures who were either warriors in their own nation or high ranking political figures in foreign nations. In fact, there are several examples of this, which is why it is essential to understand the context of each one. For example, Joseph was taken to Egypt by force, yet his role as governor there was a prophetic representation of the Messiah, and at the same time, it served the purpose of saving his family. David was a king anointed by the Eternal because of his obedience, and because from his lineage the Messiah would come. The wars he fought were to protect the people of Israel of the Old Covenant. This is very important since they were part of the inheritance given since the days of Noah. But it's important to know that Israel ceased to be a holy and consecrated land when Yeshua resurrected. It is even said that it would be trampled by the Gentiles, and that is exactly what is happening right now with those who claim to be Jews but are not, exactly as it says in the Bible. Then there is Daniel, who, as we recall, was also taken by force to Babylon and compelled to be trained as one of the wise men in the royal court. But because he was righteous and obedient, the Eternal blessed him, and his purpose served a divine purpose to help lead his people out of the exile. In other words, each of them had a very specific purpose and was guided by the Eternal to fulfill it. Every one of them was righteous, obedient, and faithful to the Eternal. None acted out of personal desire, ambition, or self will. They were all deeply humble, and it was precisely because of that humility that the Eternal chose them for such significant roles. Positions that were never meant to grant them power, but to fulfill a much greater plan, the coming of the Messiah. In fact, there were groups in Israel, such as the Zealots, who were like nationalist Israelites, but they were fighting for a cause that was already lost and was no longer worth pursuing. This becomes evident when, after the coming of the Messiah and establishment of the Brit Hadashah, or the New Covenant, and the good news, figures or roles of that kind cease to appear and to be necessary. And naturally, this is because the ultimate purpose had already been accomplished, and for that very reason, such things no longer correspond to us today. On the other hand, nationalism involves placing almost total trust in politics and political leaders, and much of its movement revolves around making political reforms and changes under the supposed goal of building a better nation. As the Americans say, make America great again. But Yeshua never placed his trust in this world, neither in the ministers of the temple, nor in the Sanhedrin, nor in any human authority, not even in the nation of Judah itself, and certainly not in Rome. On the contrary, he strongly rebuked and exposed them. And this idea had already been expressed by the prophets. In the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 5, it says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in men." Why? Because in Jeremiah's time, the Israelites had the same problem. They trusted their king instead of the Eternal. They relied on other nations, on Egypt and on the world in general, to save them instead of the Eternal. And today it's the same. We cannot place our trust in our country to save us, or nor in our rulers to make our lives better in this world. And Yeshua himself said that his kingdom was not of this world, and he never tried to change anything about the government of his time. In fact, many people during his time, including some of his own disciples, did not understand this. Actually, many believers of his time thought that Yeshua would take up arms, gather an army, and free Judah from the Roman rule. But no, what did he actually say? My kingdom is not of this world. That was his response to Pilate when he asked if he was a king. And how did Yeshua answer him? In John chapter 18, verse 36, he said that if his kingdom were of this world, his followers would have fought to prevent him from being handed over to the leaders of the temple. And before that, when the Pharisees questioned him about whether taxes should be paid or not, he simply asked them whose image was on the coin. And when they answered, he told them that whatever bore Caesar's image should be given to Caesar. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and everything else, our devotion, our service, obedience, and our lives, belongs to the eternal. Now, it's also important to understand that nowadays we cannot simply say, well, I'm not going to pay taxes or follow the laws anymore because I only live under the Torah of the Father and His commandments. No, we cannot do that because logically we would be fined or punished, and if we refuse, we would end up in prison. In other words, unless we live completely isolated in the mountains, we inevitably have to interact with politics in one way or another. Not because we want to, but precisely because of what Yeshua said: render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto the eternal what is the eternal's. Obviously, we have to cooperate just as Joseph and Daniel did. They worked with the authorities, yet they never put them above their faith. They were respectful, they paid taxes, and they followed the laws. But whenever something contradicted the will of the eternal, that was the line they would not cross. And what we should do is remain attentive to the changes taking place in the world and in politics. There's nothing wrong with being well informed. It allows us to know how to act if political situations begin to involve us, even against our will. And after all, it is part of what we must do simply by living in this world. Of course, only if it doesn't become a priority over obedience and our faith, because faith and obedience comes first, and then our cooperation with the authorities and our study to inform ourselves about politics. Before we wrap up, it's very important to understand that the great powers of the world, like the one we have been talking about, the Bible actually refers to them as beasts. In fact, in the book of Daniel, he describes a vision in which he saw different beasts, each one representing a nation that will rise in the future. Babylon was represented by a lion, the Medo Persian Empire by a bear, Greece by a leopard, and Rome by a terrifying deformed beast, something monstrous and inhuman. And interestingly, all of them eventually fell, but the legacy of each one, especially the last two, remains deeply rooted in the world today, the Greek and the Roman. From that point on, the scriptures say that the Satan was bound, and that's why no new world empire rose again after the fall of Rome. But eventually, a new global power would appear, and at that moment, he would be released once more. That new empire, that new beast, is England. And we can see this in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, where it says, and I saw a beast arising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne, and great authority. In other words, this beast seems to combine the features of all the previous beasts. It inherits their knowledge and the power from the past, and the dragon, meaning Satan, gives it authority. The fact that it rises out of the sea could be a direct reference of how England is an island surrounded by the sea, and how its colonizers came by sea, settled on land, and from that land another beast later emerged, the United States. This is seen just a few verses later from the verses 11 to 12, and it says, then I saw another beast arising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was held. This symbolizes a new empire after Rome appearing to defend freedom and religion, like a lamb, but ultimately gaining global control, promoting loyalty and worship toward the system of the beast. Then it's logical to think that this second beast represents the United States, which happens to fit all those characteristics. First, it says the beast comes up out of the earth. This means it rises from an unpopulated land, like the sea, essentially built by men from the ground up. In other words, it's a nation that was created almost from nothing by people themselves, just like how the United States rose as a world power after its revolution and later became a global hegemon after World War II. The two horns represent authority, and the phrase, like a lamp, reflects the image of the Messiah, meaning this nation claims to carry the message of the Messiah and uses his image, but falsely. This is clearly seen in how the US presents itself to the world through its dominant religion, Protestant or evangelical Christianity, which appears peaceful, free, and noble on the surface, yet promotes false ideals, claiming divine backing, to the point that actually one of its leaders dared to call America a peacemaker and unifier, despite all the wars and divisions it has caused around the world. And that's why the text says that it speaks like a dragon. It means its appearance and what it claims to be are pure deception. When it speaks like a dragon. It denies the Torah, rejects the true teachings of the Messiah, preaches a false gospel, talks only about worldly matters, curses those who oppose it, and uses its authority to threaten and impose loyalty, just as the United States pressures and subdues the nations that stand against it. And finally, it says it exercises the authority of the first beast, which is England. Now, all of this is supported by historical and academic sources, but if it still sounds hard to believe, we can simply look at what Satan himself said in the book of Luke, chapter 4. When he tried to tempt Yeshua the Messiah, he showed him all the kingdoms of the world in an instant and said, "If you worship me, it will all be yours. I will give you all the authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want." He's saying it as clearly as possible. All the kingdoms of the world in every age have been handed over to him, and obviously those who serve those kingdoms are serving him. And well, we have looked at this in a very summarized and surface level way. There are many more details to explore, like Masonry in the United States, but this is enough to understand that as believers, we definitely do not want to serve the system, not in the slightest, and not only to this country, but any nation in the world. In conclusion, should a believer be nationalist? The answer is obviously no. Being nationalist is a form of blasphemy and rebellion against the eternal toward any country, but especially toward the example of this country we have been talking about. In the end, as believers, we have to understand that we are not supposed to be involved in politics or the military at all. Using this country as an example, it claims to be the land of freedom, but we know that our freedom doesn't come from a nation and our hope doesn't rely on promises or politicians or leaders. Our trust isn't in the army or power or homeland because those things will eventually consume us until we lose who we really are. Our hope and confidence rely only in the promises that will be fulfilled one day. The return to the heavenly dwelling places that were promised to us long ago, and now those signs are becoming more and more evident, sometimes so obvious that it's hard not to see them, yet sadly many people still don't. What we find in the scriptures, especially in the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant, in the Good News, is that we as believers are meant to be observers of what happens in the world. We let things unfold, we don't interfere, we don't get involved, we don't take risks for this world, and we don't defend what the world defends. We don't invest in earthly causes, and our faith and hope are not placed in men or nations. If a war breaks out, we don't support any side, and it's not that we want war, but as believers, we understand that war is in fact part of the Eternal's plan. All this injustice has to keep growing, building up like a snowball until one day it'll explode. or maybe as a third world war, or perhaps the first and last nuclear war. And maybe then the final judgment will come, and we'll finally understand why it's described as a judgment of fire. And that is why we can't fight for peace or fight for any side. Yeshua himself said in John chapter 14, verse 17, that the peace he gives is not kind the world gives. It's not peace on earth, because this world is doomed to decay, it's beyond repair. We as believers are pilgrims and foreigners in this world. That's why our group has that name. As believers, we know that our origin was never here on earth. And even though our bodies are made of dust and will return to dust, our souls share the same nature as the angels. We shouldn't fight or suffer or die for this world, because doing so would mean despising and wasting our own souls. And finally, in the Brit Hadashah, or the good news, in Philippians chapter 3, verses 20 to 21, we're told that our citizenship is in heaven. That alone should be enough to make us understand that since the sacrifice of Yeshua, he has brought the kingdom of heaven to us, and now we are the temple, the dwelling place of the Father's presence, no longer tied to any nation or land. And that's it for this topic. Thank you so much for staying until the end. There's a lot more information that we have left out of this video, otherwise it would be way too long, like the pagan Masonic background of this country or the origins of democracy. But if you'd like us to talk more about those topics, remember that you can leave us a comment and suggest a subject, and we will cover it. If you have learned something new or this helped shift your perspective a bit about nationalism, we invite you to leave a comment and share this video with those people who need to see the truth or you would like to see getting closer to the eternal. And that's all for now. See you in the next video. Shalom.